Welcome to the special sustainability focus series of Business Talk here on Business Tech. Now, in November this year, Egypt is going to host an event that many believe to be the world's best last chance to get runaway climate change under control, COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. For nearly 3 decades, the UN has been bringing together almost every country on Earth for global climate summits called COPs, which stand for Conference of the Parties. And in that time, climate change has gone from being something of a fringe issue to a global priority. Certainly on the boards of all of the business leaders that I chat to, it's right in the center of the board pack now. And I've read somewhere that net zero might require 18 times the renewable energy capacity of 2020. So where are we on this road to net zero? I think there is sometimes some confusion. To talk about the race to net zero, I'm joined by Paul O'Flaherty, who's EY Parthenon Africa leader. Paul, welcome to the show. In order to understand where we are on this journey to net zero, firstly, I think we need to have a common understanding, I think, of what it is. So what is net zero from where you're sitting?
So I think we have to start off with the fact that we're in carbon surplus in the atmosphere, and all of the countries, from a country perspective, are making commitments about where they see countries going to and how they're going to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. So when you translate it down to companies, and I agree with you, it can be really confusing and really misunderstood. Because you get carbon neutral, carbon negative, net zero. So effectively what it is what companies are firstly doing is trying to get to carbon neutral. And that means everything that I emit from a greenhouse gases, I can offset it through a project, etc. So at least I'm not adding. But net zero is actually then standing behind country commitments of actually reducing your emissions, as well as then offsetting whatever the residual is. So it's a very science-based approach to it over time. It's not something you can do tomorrow.
Yeah. But to understand that there is a set limit as to how much carbon we can emit into the atmosphere before we breach 1.5 degrees and other critical kind of point of no return peak scenarios. What have countries agreed to here? What does that mean for us here in South Africa in terms of our nationally determined contributions?
Yeah, so South Africa at the previous COP made significant reductions in our carbon, our nationally determined contributions by 2030. So we haven't done it out to 2050. And it was significant reduction on what we've done before. And therefore, if you look at the big polluters in terms of emissions, would be the Eskoms, the Sasols, some of the smelters in the ferroalloys business. They are the big ones, and how are they then going to adapt in helping the country reduce its emissions? I mean, there's been South African inventory on where the emissions are coming from, so it's quite clear from a scientific point of view where it all is. It's how does government get the companies behind this to commit? I mean, you've got to talk about incentives, you've got to talk about grants. You can't just have a big stick behind it, and I think that's where people are struggling to really think through how you do this.
Yeah, because I mean, if you look at it, I was reading a report from the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air. Eskom, the world's biggest emitter of sulfur dioxide, for example, and the quantum we produce relative to the major economies is really staggering. And so clearly, I mean, it's not a direct greenhouse gas like CO2 or methane, but it's an indirect gas because when coupled with elemental carbon, it forms aerosols. But I think the point is, and often what I hear when I have this conversation with people outside the kind of the weeds of the science is, well, why should we be doing anything? We're South Africa. We emit less than 1% of the global emissions, and we need to wait for China and the US and other countries to do their bit. Then you listen to a guy like the CEO of Eskom, Andre de Ruyter, say, well, carbon border adjustment mechanisms are coming, carbon taxes. So if you start thinking about it from that perspective, you could be losing key export markets. So what is the tone of the debate around net zero from where you're sitting, Paul?
I think the debate has definitely got into a better debate. If you compare this to 18 months ago, with exactly what Andre is saying, is carbon taxes are a reality. I think National Treasury recently announced they're not going to reduce it. They're not going to provide further exemptions. The carbon border adjustment mechanisms is big. It's coming in Europe. We're finding locally a lot of companies that export engaging with us and other firms trying to find out exactly what this means. So it's a reality. And I think people are realizing, that the business case here is, are you going to be a sustainable business in the future? Will you survive? I think that's what it's coming down to.
That's pretty much an existential question for any business. When we look at the targets, what kind of targets are in place specifically for us here in South Africa?
Well, at the moment, it's only the commitments that we've made, and I'm just reading it here. So 398 million tons by 2030, which is a significant reduction on what we do and what's forecast that we do. So that is a significant, I think it's 20 or 25% less than what we had. So if you stand behind that, there's science behind it about where the emitters are. But what I think everybody is waiting for is, well, what is the net zero plan for the businesses? And I know the UK government is talking about legislating for listed companies that you actually have to publish your net zero plan and what it is you're going to do to conform to the requirements.
So, that was going to be my next question, really. What is the big plan in general? Because I think, I've seen the National Business Initiative, for example, put a figure of somewhere around 4 trillion rand for us to reach our net zero goals. And within that, obviously, costs, but also opportunities for new industries. And I think here of green iron ore, for example, which you can then, you can use green hydrogen, you can export it to Europe. There are opportunities. It's not just costs, but what is the big plan?
So today, there isn't one from a South African perspective. What there is a lot of initiatives. So, the $8.5 trillion that's been promised to South Africa, where does that get spent to green the economy? The whole debate about just energy transition, when we have a coal industry that's making a lot of money through exports for the country. The carbon taxes is a reality. There are certain grants and incentives, but not enough. So, if you're sitting back in business, and I reflect on my own career, if I was sitting at ArcelorMittal, what is going to be the business case here in a short and medium term for me to do? Because you're going to pay a lot of money, and sometimes the numbers don't always stack up in a traditional financial model. So I think the relationship between government, between labor, between business, that's got to be the compact, Michael, of what South Africa is going to do.
Yeah, and I can look at that and say, well, then we need to be thinking about how governments, through DFIs, for example, play a role in catalyzing investments into new industries. And again, in the kind of green iron example, we know it's possible technically. Is it commercially viable? Who's going to take that first risk in building out new plant in order to build out this industry of the future? That could be a big employer. So you bring labor in, you bring government, you bring business around the table and say, well, there's the opportunity.
There, and there's two very good examples right now, Michael. So we've been attending a lot of these hydrogen industry days. And if you spoke hydrogen in the South African economy 2 years ago, now you're having a proper discussion. My understanding from the IDC and talking to them is there's going to be a master plan, like the steel master plan, a master plan for hydrogen and the development of the hydrogen economy, because the export potential for Africa is significant. The other one is the automobile industry. I interestingly read some commentary this week where the comment was made, well, electric vehicles are for rich people, so why should South Africa get behind it? But we have a massive export of vehicles that we're building for the rest of the world. Yeah. Why aren't we going to be a node of electric vehicle manufacturing for export? And those are the types of key decisions we need to think through.
Yeah, but they need long-term, policy certainty. Back to the steel master plan, the automotive industry is successful because we had the MIDP, now we've got the AIDP. They give you 10, 15, 20-year periods of certainty. And if we're not thinking about how we play in the EV value chain, we can almost just kiss our automotive industry goodbye, because that's where the world is going.
Correct. But that's why I'm really interested to see what the hydrogen master plan has to say.
And we've got all those, and we've heard at the conferences, we've got the key competitive advantages: wind, solar. We've got the technology. We've got abundant natural resources that we could then beneficiate and export. So now what does this mean here in the broader context of net zero? Because I still sense that there is a fair degree of cynicism around committing to a target out to 2050 to say, right, we can all, produce a sustainability report to say, yes, we're committed to net zero because it's the next management team's problem. What does this mean practically today?
No, you're right, and that's why I often put myself into those positions of CEOs and CFOs and say, what does this all mean to me? But I think because the pressure is coming. I mean, investors, funders, etc., are shying away from investments in certain areas. So that's where you can see the opportunity. So the simple advice that we like to give is, the first is, acknowledge there's an issue. Get a handle on what you actually emit from a scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 as a company, and plot what you believe is a reasonable trajectory and plan, and put a business case behind it about how it is you're going to do. And then you're going to have a lot of stakeholder communication and engagement around it, and then obviously start executing on the plan. But the sooner companies start with that, the better, because you can't just do things in isolation. You've got to try and look at that bigger picture. I think every board, every executive needs to think about the long-term value here, Michael. You can't just be short-termism.
Interestingly, I was chatting to a fintech based in Cape Town the other day that's just recently launched a business to use carbon offsets for your online shopping and e-commerce. So they match you, and they'll say, well, that pair of sneakers has a carbon footprint of X, and so we're going to offset it by adding a couple of % to the purchase price, but then that's going to go into a fund that's going to offset it by planting more trees elsewhere in the world, for example. And I said, well, how did you fund the business? He's young, he's in his 20s, he's got a couple of senior statesmen on the board who are actually his mentors. He said, that was the easiest part because of the focus on sustainability. There's a lot of funding out there, I think was his message, Paul, that if you are tackling this in the right way, there is a potential capital allocation solution for you as well.
Definitely, Michael. And I think we were at the South African REIT Industry Day, if you recall, I think last year.
Yeah.
And it was eye-watering what the numbers rolling off the bankers' mouths were about what is actually available if you really focus and target on it. And that's the issue. If you can put your plan together, you can get a business case behind it, you can get your stakeholders on board. I think that example is correct. Here you've got a package that provides you really good green financing. But unless you've got a plan, it's just talk.
Absolutely. Well, Paul, that's where we're going to have to leave it. Thanks so much for sharing some more in the sustainability focus series of Business Talk with us here on Business Tech. Take care.
Thank you.
That was Paul O'Flaherty, who's EY, a Parthenon Africa leader, diving into the weeds a little bit on what net carbon zero means, and net zero, and getting through all the acronyms. There are lots in the space, but ultimately it is about tapping into the zeitgeist, and that is that businesses face an existential threat if they don't start thinking about this pathway into what the future is going to look like in a decarbonized global economy. You've been watching Business Talk here on Business Tech.